So now that we've worked our way through the income statement, we're going to go back and start with the balance sheet. So we're going to work our way line by line down the balance sheet until we get all the way to chapter 13, where we cover the last section, that statement, the stockholders' equity section. So the first section of the balance sheet is the assets. The first asset that we always see listed is cash. So chapter 7 is really all in dealing with cash. But we talk about cash, we're primarily going to zero in our efforts on that concept of internal control and that audit focus. So we talked about this a little bit back in the earlier chapters at the beginning of this course, but we're going to go in and talk about that audit function a lot more. Now, I do want to go ahead and point out, you'll notice that there's a lot of Chapter 7 that we're not covering. Not that it's not important and really good information that you need to know, but just because there's a limited amount of time that we have to cover all of the information. So we're only covering Objective 1 and Objective 6 out of this chapter. So the rest of it you can read through, but you won't be tested over. So remember that companies are required to be audited. If you are a publicly traded company, the SEC requires by law that you are audited. Even non-publicly traded companies are oftentimes audited because their shareholders or their constituents want that audit. So that audit is where those external accountants come in and they go through your financial records with a fine-tooth comb. And they're really looking to make sure that your accounting system is set up correctly, is set up to follow GAAP. And then they're also looking at what are called your internal controls. And the internal controls are all the things that we do as a company internally to protect our assets, to make sure that employees are following the rules, and to keep all of our information safe. So remember, accounting is not just the dollars and cents, but it's the entire information system. So internal controls involves all of the IT and everything components that we do to protect our information. We also want to, if we have good internal controls, that should help us be more efficient and help our financial statements be reliable, because we know that the information that's going into it is good, therefore we can trust the information coming out. So again, we talked about this a little bit back in chapter 1, but the Sarbanes-Oxley Act is actually a law. This is an actual law, not a FASB pronouncement. It's not part of GAAP. It was passed in 2002 in really the wake of the Enron scandal. So back in 2001, there were a lot of accounting scandals. Enron certainly was not the only one. It just happened to be the biggest one. So Waste Management, Tyco, WorldCom, there were a number of accounting scandals that all kind of happened back then. And in the wake of that scandal, we had what's called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It's named for the two congressmen that put it forth, Mr. Sarbanes and Mr. Oxley. And interesting fact, Sarbanes-Oxley Act is the fastest law to have ever been signed into law. So if you have watched that Schoolhouse Rock of, how a bill becomes a law, I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. That one. So Sarbanes-Oxley went from being a bill introduced in the House to being signed into law in 9 months. And that's the fastest that any bill has become a law in the history of the United States. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley did a lot of things, but the thing that we're mostly concerned about here is that it required upper level management to take responsibility for the internal controls of the company and the accuracy and completeness of the financial reports. So no longer could your CEO, your CFO say, well, I didn't know there was fraud going on. It's not my fault. I'm not the one who did it. Blame it on the accountants. Now they have to take personal responsibility for this. So Again, Sarbanes-Oxley did a lot of things, and we're certainly not going to cover all of them, but they said that companies have to issue an internal control report. So if you've gone in and looked at one of those annual reports, one of the things you're going to see in there is an internal control report, which talks about management's describing their responsibility for their internal controls, as well as the adequacy of their internal controls. Also, when the auditors come out, they're not just looking at the financial records, they're also evaluating the internal controls, and they issue an audit report. Now, auditors have always issued an audit report, and the audit report goes something like this. We feel that the financial statements of XYZ company present fairly in all material respects and are prepared according to the generally accepted accounting principles of the United States, blah, 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 blah. That's not new. They've always had to do that. But now they also have to issue either a second report or they amend that report to say we've also looked at the internal controls and we feel they're adequate, or we've looked at the internal controls and they're lacking, and we told management and management didn't fix them, right? So the auditors have to come in and be that expert on there. Sarbanes-Oxley also created the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. This really is the governing body over that audit function. We're not really going to talk about that, but for those of you that go on and take some more accounting classes and you take audit, you'll talk about them a lot. It also made some provisions. So one of the things that Sarbanes-Oxley said is that accounting firms are not allowed to provide consulting services also. So you can audit, or what's called provide assurance services. Audit and assurance services are the same thing. Or you can provide consulting services, but you can't do both. And the reason is, and what this is part of what happened with Enron, is that the auditors, which were for Arthur Andersen, which was the oldest and largest audit firm in the world. So I need you to understand this was a really big deal. They saw what Enron was doing. Now, Enron did try to hide it and did a very good job of hiding it, but they saw what Enron was doing and they're like, I don't think this is necessarily correct, right? But when the auditors took it back to their managers, see, the thing was that Enron was paying Arthur Andersen a lot of money to audit, but they were also paying Arthur Andersen a whole lot more money to provide consulting services. So when the auditors went to their managers and said, hey, I don't think, this thing that Enron's doing here, these fake companies that they made up that they all named after Star Wars characters, yeah, that's for real. I don't think that's exactly correct. Well, when they tried to talk to Enron executives said, you know what, we did everything correctly, and if you don't like it, we're going to pull our consulting business. Well, now they're like, you know what, we can't afford to lose our consulting business, so you just go ahead and sign off. I've looked at them, it all looks good, right? So that's considered to be a conflict of interest, and they're not allowed to do that anymore. It also made it very stiff penalties for executives now. So again, no more just a slap on the wrist. We're talking 25 years in prison, 20 years in prison for falsifying records, for knowing that there's fraud going on and not doing anything about it. So getting back to internal control, there's 5 components of it. So as we walk through again these internal control procedures, the C was control procedures, so that's the first one we're going to look at. Now there's a lot of control procedures. I've just listed a few of them here on this slide. One of the control procedures that we have is that we want to make sure that the people that we hire are competent, they are reliable, they are ethical. We're doing background checks on them. We're checking references. We're checking that they actually have the degrees and certificates that they say they had. It was just a few years ago that I believe it was Notre Dame, large university, hired a football coach, and it turns out he didn't even actually have a college degree. He claimed he did on his resume, but they didn't check. And they hired him, and it turns out he really didn't even have a degree. So we need to be checking these things out. Now, assignment of responsibilities is an interesting one. Assignment of responsibilities said that every task should have an owner. That way we know that everything is getting done, and if we find something isn't done, we know whose responsibility it is. This keeps things from falling through the cracks. Now, that's different from separation of duties. Separation of duties says that you don't want one person doing all of the steps in a process. So, for example, you don't want the same person collecting cash from customers, recording that cash in the accounting records, depositing the cash in the bank, and then doing the bank reconciliation. It's too easy for one person to cover their tracks if they're doing all the steps. We want different people doing steps. Now, this is hard to do in a small business, in a small company. I used to work as an accountant for a small real estate agency, and we sold property, but we also had a very large rental property management. And so we collected rent from like 500 different, we had over 500 different rent houses that we collected rent on and things like that. So it was my job to collect the cash and record it, but then I had somebody else deposited it, and then somebody else did the bank reconciliation. And that's not even ideal. Really, we wanted somebody doing each of those steps separately, but so that one person's collecting, a separate person's recording, a third person is depositing, and a fourth person is doing the bank reconciliation. So again, our internal control procedures are our audits. We want our internal audits. That internal auditor is constantly reviewing and monitoring and updating. And then we have those external audits performed by those independent auditors. Documents. We need to have paper trail. We want to have documents for everything that happens. We want to have especially pre-numbered documents. And then a lot of this goes into our electronic devices. We want to make sure that, again, the more electronic devices that we have, generally the more secure things are, not necessarily, but generally. But again, if you have sensors attached to inventory, that helps to reduce theft. Sign-ons help keep people that are not authorized from getting into the computer system and things like that. Again, encryption, firewalls, you want your passwords, they need to be changed every so many days. You can't have the super easy passwords. We want to make sure mandatory vacations and job rotations. This is a big one. One of the things that auditors look for that they call a red flag is an employee who hasn't taken a vacation or has never called in sick, because that not always, certainly, but sometimes can indicate that that employee is trying to hide something. So the R in the acronym CRIME stands for risk assessment. And the idea is the greater the risk, the more controls you want in place. There's a cost benefit analysis to internal controls. I mean, we can put a retina scan on everything, but if it's not worth that much, then the retina scan is probably more expensive than what it's trying to protect. So there's a risk reward relationship here. And the I in crime stands for the information system. Again, we talked about this a little bit in control procedures. We want to make sure that only people who need to have access to our information. So again, we want to make sure that when employees leave us, that we change their password, that we take their username out so that they can't come and log back in. We don't want to just grant everyone access to everything. I always use the example here at TCC. I do a lot of advising, so I have access to look up student records and then I can see what classes that you've taken and things like that. I don't have access to see your financial records because I don't need that to do my job. So I have access to see what I need, but I don't have right access. For example, I can't say, oh, Johnny made a B in that class. Surely he should have made an A, and go in and change your grade. I don't have access to do that. I can see what you took, but I don't have right access. I can't change things. So the M in control procedures stands for monitoring of controls. And again, that is primarily the duty of the internal auditor. So we've talked about the internal auditor a lot here. Then that external auditor is going to come in and they're going to evaluate those controls and they're going to evaluate our system and make sure that that is prepared, that the results are prepared according to GAAP. And then the last one is the internal control environment. This refers to what we call the tone at the top or the culture of the business. So the idea is that, look, there's fraud going on in probably every organization. But if upper level management is good people, then this is probably a good organization. But if, like, for example, in the case of Enron, upper level management was not good people, so to speak. If you're interested in that, there's a really great book. There's also a movie, but I do encourage you don't watch that when small children are within, I don't know, a 5-mile radius because the language is really bad. But it's called, I believe, The Smartest People in the Room. It might be The Smartest Men in the Room, one of those two. I apologize. I don't have the book with me at the moment. But it's a really interesting book as far as what the Enron scandal was. But it was really the brainchild. It was really perpetrated by the COO and the CFO. And they're the ones who came up with this idea of here's what we're going to do to fraudulate our financial statements. So while there were a lot of really good people who worked for Enron who did nothing wrong, who didn't know that there was anything going on at Enron that was wrong or bad or illegal or unethical. They were just there doing their job and they just saw their one little piece and they didn't have a big picture to see the whole fraud going on. They got very, very hurt because the tone at the top was bad. Now, we've talked a little bit about there is a cost benefit analysis of internal controls. There's also this idea of what we call collusion, and collusion is two or more people working together. So a lot of controls can be overcome if you've got a partner working with you. So when we talked about separation of duties, maybe we've got the collection of cash and the depositing and the recording separated. But if I have a partner working with me, so I collect the cash, I record it, but really I pocketed it, and then the person who's doing the bank reconciliation knows and is in on it, they can help cover the tracks. So keep in mind that internal controls are not designed to completely prevent fraud. There's no possible way. Also, an audit is not designed necessarily to detect fraud. An audit is designed to make sure your financial statements are prepared according to GAAP and that your accounting system is set up according to GAAP. Now, there are certain what we call red flags that auditors look for, and if they see those red flags, then they may say, oh, I'm going to go into kind of fraud exam mode here, but they don't necessarily start out with the fraud exam mode. So now that we've talked a little bit about internal controls, we're going to skip to objective 6 where we talk about bank reconciliations.